Hello. So I'm Talisha, I'm the team leader and one of the senior OTs for Opportunity, and this is Kathleen.
Nice to meet you.
So she's also a senior at Opportunity. So just today we're going to be discussing occupational therapy and Huntington's disease. So as OTs, we provide quite a lot of holistic services. I think it's really important to discuss the services that we provide. So just as an overview, these are some of the things that we'll be discussing today. So just some of the resources that we use. Risks associated with Huntington's disease, some assessments that we provide, interventions, and then we go on to just for some equipment. So talking about palliative care, one of the things that I find that I have done quite a lot of research on is social death. So what social death is, it's a social death prior to a biological death. So what that means is when a person doesn't have the services, doesn't have the equipment, doesn't have the support that they require to engage in meaningful activities, they have a social death, which means they're restricted within their home and are unable to achieve or complete any activities that they really enjoy doing. This is something that's quite common in neurological conditions when someone's bound to either their bed or in their home, and meaningful activities such as going to the beach and, flying a kite aren't able to be achieved for some reason or another. So we want to try and avoid social death as much as possible. Aspiration pneumonia, obviously engaging a speech pathologist is really important for a number of reasons, which we'll also discuss. Cognitive decline, progression of disease, falls, occupational deprivation, which is also very similar to social death. So that, again, is the disengagement in occupation, meaningful activities, things that people really enjoy doing in everyday life. Environmental barriers, so things like stairs where people can't access if they are in a wheelchair, are also really important to discuss, and also things that as occupational therapists, we can try and navigate somehow. There's lots of equipment out there, it's just most of the time finding what equipment you can modify to suit the person. As OTs, that's our job. I would rather find equipment that can be modified than try and squeeze a person to try and fit the equipment, because that's not what we want to achieve. Neglect of hygiene, care of fatigue and stress. As OTs, when we often come in, which I'll again discuss a little bit later, we often want to address carer fatigue straight away. So are the carers fatigued? Are they experiencing a high level of stress? What can we do about that? How can we promote services to be involved so that we can limit that as much as possible? We want to try and prolong carers to be involved for as long as possible. Decreased quality of life, suicide or suicidal ideation, discrimination, behaviours of concern, vulnerability, exploitation, lack of insight, and social isolation. So these are all things that we can avoid with equipment as much as possible. So for us coming in, one of the most important things is we need to assess the home environment and their functional capacity. So I just recently did a training just for OT specifically, and one of the things we discussed was the barrier to being engaged in the first place. So again, we'd love to know what that person loves to do and how then we can best discuss with them and engage in services. So do they love, one of my clients loves Marvel. So I went in there and I was like, let's talk about Captain America. And that was an icebreaker for us to discuss certain things. As OTs, there is already a power imbalance with us going into someone's home. That's their home, that's not our home. Therefore, we need to respect their environment, and we also need to understand there's an imbalance there straight away, and how do we try and reduce that imbalance as much as possible. Obviously, the most important thing is that person is a master of themselves. They know everything about themselves. We don't. They have the opportunity to tell us about their lives and how then we can provide services to support them. So oftentimes when I've become involved with clients in general, but with clients with Huntingtons, some of the things that I run through is what support services do they have and what services are they missing. So oftentimes I'll say, do you have a support coordinator? I'll run through. So we were just discussing, sometimes physio is often missed. We want to maintain function for as long as possible. Same with speech. Even if someone doesn't have difficulties with swallowing, in the beginning we want to have that assessment just to make sure and have that speech pathologist on board ongoing. It just promotes that continuity of care, the same person providing those services over a long period of time. Making sure, if required, of course, they have a psychologist, ex-phys, podiatrist. Dietitian, I find, is something that's also commonly not engaged, which when someone has quite significant movements and they're potentially developing pressure injuries, one of the things really important is your skin is your biggest organ. So we need to make sure that your food intake, things that you're ingesting, you're able to, prevent pressure injuries or heal them as much as possible. So dietitian is often very important and often I find is missed in services.
So some of the very important interventions we often need and come across is especially early and consistent intervention. So it builds that therapeutic relationship with the client and their family when symptoms are relatively minor. That is ideal. We've often come into play at later stages and it can be a lot harder to implement different interventions then, especially equipment. So as soon as we're able to be engaged with our clients, that's really important because like Talisha said, being able to speak to them on their level, their needs, having that client-centered approach is really important to that consistent therapy. Interventions and goals reviewed regularly, as things can often change. Perceptions from the client or stakeholders as well can frequently change, and interventions increased when needed. So having that team approach from the start, everyone can stay on the same page and have that open communication as well. So early interventions enables rehabilitation strategies while the person can retain ability to learn and adapt to difficulties such as the trial processes. Oftentimes this can extend for various reasons, whether it's due to the client not being open to equipment at that time, but maybe just exposing them to the idea of it helps grade that process for them. Enabling therapists and others involved to build trust with clients as the disease progresses and more professionals become involved and decisions are made more difficult. So touching once again on earlier introduction to different supports really helps that process move along. Establish goals regarding end of life and goals whilst the client has capacity.
So something that I've found really interesting is I've been in stakeholders meetings with 6 or 7 professionals and the client's not in the room. So that is obviously we're missing the vital part there where the person doesn't have any discussion around the decisions and the things being discussed. So it's really important, and I'm sure it seems obvious, but sometimes it can be missed, that the client is actually in the room, that person is there and their voice is being heard. So any services being provided should be explained to all relevant and key stakeholders, including the family. So oftentimes, OT is very broad. What do we do? I don't even know. I do.
About everything.
You need to adapt it to the person's situation. So obviously if I'm seeing a child, my explanation of OT is going to be different to if I'm seeing an adult. And if I'm doing equipment, things like that. So as OTs and as health professionals, we need to make sure that what we're doing is being explained to every single person involved, especially family and key stakeholders, the client. We need to make sure that that person understands what we're doing and the plan moving forward.
So recommendations for therapy is best provided both verbally and in email handovers if possible. So everyone involved is kept up to date with progress of information and status of interventions. So we've often found that that's the best way in between stakeholder meetings as well, just to keep everyone informed.
For that, it's all about like the continuity. So we want to make sure that what we've said in that appointment is then carried over. Me saying to one support worker and the client and the person, this is what we're going to do next time, that's not enough. That needs to be handed over to everybody. That way everyone's aware of the plan moving forward, because information can quite quickly get lost in translation, and then it might be very confusing as to what was the speechy doing, what's the physio doing, what's the OT doing. The support worker had this really incredible strategy that they're using, but they're the only ones using it. So everyone needs to make sure they're all on the same page, and often that can be done by just providing email handovers to all of the stakeholders, obviously if the client is consenting to that.
And keeping in mind that fatigue can be debilitating, so we try to keep our sessions as limited to the capacity that the client has at the time. We work very dynamically with them and ensure that maybe we've future planned if we know that they can only withstand us for 30 minutes, especially in terms of equipment. That can be quite fatiguing in itself with transfers and whatnot. So in order to do that, a bit of future planning to have multiple sessions within that same week can definitely help that process as well. Also limiting or reducing dual task performance, such as cognitive or physical, rather than keeping in mind if a person is walking. Avoid engaging in conversation, as it may impact or affect their ability to mobilise as well.
So oftentimes we won't trial a wheelchair, a bed, a mattress, a commode, all in one appointment. We'll make sure that it's split up into multiple different appointments, and relying again on the person to tell us when the best time of day that they require, and how long they can go. If it's only 30 minutes, that's cool. If they're having a really good day, we can go for a little bit longer. We also try and avoid having appointments if they're going out, and we don't want to fatigue them if they're going to the beach or doing activities that they really enjoy doing, and our appointment's going to fatigue them and they won't be able to engage. So these are just some things that I've found over time. So one of the things that as an OT I've found a little bit frustrating is, again, the equipment available doesn't always suit the client, and the client has to fit into that equipment. And as an OT, I don't really think that fits very well with me and doesn't sit well. So one of the things that, these are just some of the things that I've found. So U-step walkers, so what they do is you can adjust the resistance, and they're more of a pull to move. So rather than a normal walker, which you have to push the brakes on and then it moves, you have to actually activate the handle up for... Hello? Yep. For it to actually release the brakes, and then the resistance on the bottom you can change, so depending on that movement you can adjust it. Wheelchairs is something that, again, I've struggled with. So someone that I work with who has a diagnosis of Huntingtons, we really struggled to find a wheelchair that was suitable to them, that wasn't causing injury all of the time. And I stumbled across the Netty Dynamic Tilt and Space wheelchair, which that chair moves with that person. So as they extend out, the leg rest extends out and comes back up. As they move back, the whole thing moves back. So the head support, the back support, and the seat pan will shift with them. And that can be adjusted depending on the severity of that cardiac movements. It can be adjusted up if there's more significant movements, or down if there's sort of less. That really changed one of our clients' lives. They went from being very unhappy with me, which is totally fair, to being
in bed all the time.
Yep, to being very happy with me. They were able to sit with a padded belt and then just lean to the floor, pick up something, and off they go. So to me, that was incredible, and as an OT, that was a really proud moment, and something that I've found really, really helpful, and I think more people should know about. So for us, again, so these are just some more clinical considerations, but these are sort of the things that we run through when we're with a client and a person with Huntington. So we just want to make sure that we reduce the fatigue as much as possible, maintaining that energy and muscle control. But we can do that through equipment. So again, like I said, with injuries can occur if it's not padded or if it just isn't suitable to that client. Future planning, so seeing potentially what might be useful in the future, not just right now. Looking at postural control and management, so there's a few things that I often will look at. So we don't want to have something that's too big for the person, or too small, or not long enough, or too long. So there is quite a lot that will go into one prescription, but I won't go into too much detail because I might bore you with that. But I get really excited, so if you do have any questions, feel free to ask. So scripted wheelchairs often require a multi-dis approach. So if we've got someone who has quite complex seating, potentially with someone with Huntingtons, we want to involve the physio, we want to involve the speechy, because then we can provide a wheelchair that's suitable for all of their needs. We don't just want to look at it from an OT lens, because that's not enough. We want to look at it from a multi-dis approach. So transfers, again, is something that I have struggled with. And again, my client was not happy with me because I wasn't able to find a solution until I was. So with hoisting, so they were in a hoist. I had a pivot frame, which I won't explain, but it wasn't suitable. They were hitting their head on it. So what was the solution? My solution was that we found that 4-point spreader bars were the solution. They were able to have more freedom of movement, a gantry frame, so that way there was less stress on the person being transferred and less stress on the support workers. So often if we're having someone with Huntington's, that movement can be quite stressful if you're suspended above the ground in a hoist. That can be very stressful. So finding solutions to how we best support that transfer and that person feels safe.
All right, so going into self-care and hygiene. So adding padding if appropriate, such as around the cistern, may reduce the risk of head injuries. Purchasing a toilet seat with sturdy bolts, building up the toilet button with material such as moulded that hardened when it was put in place, if you can't change to a disability style toilet. Also having a tilt-in space commode, depending on the needs at the time. Visuals for toileting or showering as and if required can also support those needs.
So one of our OTs in Townsville, she has a client who has a diagnosis of Huntington's disease. He wanted to flush the toilet, and as OTs it is our job to think always outside of the box, so this was that solution. They were able to find something that hardened over time, and it built up the button for the flush, and then he was able to do that independently, and that brought quite a lot of independence back. So it's very simple sometimes solutions, but it's often thinking outside of the box. So some of the things that in relation to equipment and sleep, so I find as an OT it's really important to do a thorough assessment in relation to sleep. There's quite a lot of risks associated, especially with equipment. Entrapment and asphyxiation are often discussed. There are high concerns, especially if we've got movement involved, what that looks like, trying to reduce the risk of entrapment or asphyxiation. We've probably all heard of the Huntington's bed. Again, it depends on the OT assessment and sort of what's suitable for that client at that time or in the future. Fallout mat if required. To reduce living down the bed, it's really simple. I've had a few clients, people that I've worked with that really struggle to sort of maintain that position because of the movements. Just very simply elevate the head, apply the knee brake a little bit, and they don't slide down the bed. Again, future planning, if a pressure redistribution mattress is required for that person, by making sure that they're involved in the process of all of the trials. And a monitoring system if required, obviously for consent. These are just some of the things that we've found to promote sleep. Sleep is a non-negotiable biological necessity. That's a mouthful, but it is. So everybody needs to sleep. Every single person here needs to sleep. We've all gone without sleep, and we know what that does and how the impact that then has. So these are just some key tips that we found to try and promote sleep. There's specific evidence on this in relation to Huntington's, but I think in general these are just some really important key points.
All right, so in terms of falls, it's good to always have a falls action plan in place that all stakeholders are aware of, especially their supports. Having a means of calling for assistance, so whether that be a personal response system, and having a lockbox on the outside so people can access the home in emergencies. Guidelines for how the person gets off the floor in those situations as well. Having a manual handling assessment and training, so that often involves both the OT and the physiotherapist. Being able to adapt the home environment, such as the furniture location, stairs, clutter, and lighting. Adapting conduction of activities, so rather than carrying items, placing them in pockets, a shoulder bag, or to allow for arms to remain free to stabilise self. Education on the need to concentrate when walking and limiting distractions. And then lastly, review and risk regularly as the condition progresses.
All right, we are almost finished, I promise. Memory. So these are just some of the things, again, that we found just to promote if the person's having difficulties with memory. So little things like diaries, calendars, lists, whiteboards, sticky notes, routine boards. So what we found really helpful is if you have a routine board of who is involved. Like my face, I'm the OT. Kathleen's face, she's a support worker. She's an OT, obviously.
I'm an OT though.
And like the faces of all, so that way they know who's coming today or who's expected to come today, what the plan is today, so that we've got that routine set in place. We know what's coming today. If there's any changes, that we're discussing that, and that's being changed on the routine board. Labeling using prompts around the home, really simple, like those label makers and things like that. Again, we've sort of briefly touched on this earlier, but being concise and clear where possible, use closed questions that require less effort. And also making sure that if the person has a delayed response, you wait for that response. Trying not to, as much as it seems to be, you want to just sort of jump in, just be patient, wait, allow that person to respond. And eliminate or reduce any external stimuli where possible. You know, if there's a very large garbage truck out there, probably going to be distracted on that rather than concentrating on what's happening within that area and that services and the therapy being provided. Thank you.
Tidy it up.